Is anybody, I know Bill probably is, but I doubt if he did. Are you old enough to remember back to the 60s? You are, no. Do you remember when we used to have these? We used to. You know, we had those little sayings around. I don't know if y'all ever had them or not, but had a saying that real men don't eat quiche. Remember? But what was 70s? I don't know. I don't know when they invented it. I don't know. They've been having custard pie all the time. But whenever it was, I was still young enough to consider myself, you know. But we had that, you know, and as for me, I like quiche. You know, I said the saying because it's funny, but I said it. Then they came out with one a little bit later, said, real men don't wear pink. Remember that one, Mark? You remember that one? And then that's what it sort of morphed into, takes a real man to wear pink. It goes in. We have all these little sayings and everything. And how many of you are old enough to when you first started computers maybe back in the late 80s or early 90s or something like this? And yeah, our Apple was just not real big right yet. And everything was IBM based or, you know, Intel based, and had all sorts of stuff. Back then we didn't even, I was in job developing training material, and we used IBM computers, and we didn't even use Microsoft Word. We used, remember when Corel WordPerfect used to be what everybody used. WordPerfect was a lot more powerful. Yeah. And also, anybody ever use brown bag software? Well, we were I was developing lesson plans and stuff like this, so being able to outline stuff was very, very handy. And brown bag, you know, Microsoft didn't have an outline program yet. And brown bag software, we sneak a copy in, put it on our computers, and it was just like your outline program on your Microsoft Word now. It just worked really, really well. You know? And we'd use this. And also at that time, do you remember that Apple was just coming out, and they developed this little rodent to go in a computer called a mouse, and had a line connected to it and everything. Of course, IBM's base didn't have it, and we had those signs up on the wall said, "Real men use DOS." Because everything was, you know, you had to type in. If you wanted to copy something, you had to control whatever it was and select it and copy it and do what you wanted to, or capitalize it and decide it. But everything was keyboard control. We said that mouse is never going to take off, you know. Never going to, but it was. So now everybody uses a mouse, you know. And now we've got the ones without wires. And I ask you a question. Be honest with me. Have any of you ever picked up your mouse backwards? Have you ever done that? Is it? Well, it used to be more distinct shapes, I think. It had bigger buttons on and stuff like this and everything, you know. But a mouse, if you pick it up backwards, and it sort of throws things out of whack. You can't find your cursor. The touchscreens? I've never. I don't. I think my computer might be touchscreen, but I don't use it. It's got a mouse. I can do it, or I can look at it and click when I want to. But if you pick a mouse up backwards, hard to find stuff. Your cursor's down at the bottom, and you can't find it. You know, you're looking around. What in the world's the matter with this? Good time, my computer's on the fritz, and you look, you got it, and you pan your hand wrong. You got to turn it around. Everything's okay. And you know, you don't realize it for a little bit. I think a lot of times when we look at books like the book of Romans, we're confused because we don't know where to start from. You don't know what it's all about. I mean, you look and You got to have a background to begin from. You got to know where to begin from when you do, especially when you talk about the epistles. When you talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, and what's the difference in the style of writing between the Gospels and Acts and the book of Romans or book of Ephesians or Galatians? What do you think, Shane? How about those four, the Gospels and Acts, are narratives. They're just following a sequence of events of what happened, all right? But the epistles are different. So the epistles, I've said this before, but I've said it enough times it'll finally sink in. But the epistles are what they call occasional letters. They were written for a specific occasion. Right? You look at the book of 1 Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and you read through it, and I've got a big book by a guy called Gordon Fee, and he talks a lot about 1 Corinthians. But he talks about if you can learn just about all the hard ways to interpret passages, about every kind of passage you got to interpret in the book of Corinthians you get to. You got to look at it, and it's, it seems that when Paul's writing this, he had some communications from him telling him there were some things going on. And he was answering these questions as he went along. I think there's even one place in there that he says, and these other things, said, I'll tell you about that when I get there. You ever wonder what he told them? When he told them that? And it's just strange when you got to look at. And it's called, if you look at it, you got to look at, there's two big words. One of them's exegesis, and the other is hermeneutics. And exegesis is talking about the, one author sort of reduced it to the then and there. He said, this was what they did then, and this is there where they did it. He said, when you do exegesis, you do that. Everybody says, well, I'll just read it. And in reality, when you read something, you're actually doing exegesis in a way. Anytime you read, you're doing it because you're making decisions about what certain things mean. You might say that, well, we don't do that. But let's talk about, and Judith's here, so we can talk about that. I'm going to talk about you. No, if you go to 1 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, there's a subject there, and it's head coverings. Right? It's head coverings. And we read those verses about head coverings, right? We read them, and we know the verses where it says, hair is given as a glory, as a head covering, and and people interpret that in different ways. They interpret it different ways. And like Darlene here and Betty, they'd probably say something. What would you say if I said you got to wear a head covering? Well, the Bible says to. Why aren't you going to do it? Why aren't you going to do it, Darlene? Betty, why don't you wear a head covering? Judith probably tell you ought to wear a head covering. Okay, I would. I don't believe it either. I'd tell them just to be funny. But why wouldn't you do it? You got a reason. You can't think of it right now. But how about you, Becca? I thought you were looking right at me. Why would, if somebody told you to wear a head covering, would you do it? Why not? Yeah, I want you to answer. All right, and you saying that it only applied to that time. All right, let's go in that same chapter. And it says, nature itself teaches a man that you should have short hair. Mitch, is that the one you read? No, but we read that, Dark. Cody? I'm just saying what it says. Just saying what it says. And how many of us, I know I'm old enough that, and I don't know whether you have or not. Mark, were they still preaching sermons when you were a youngster about men should not have long hair?
I know the joke.
No, I'm not talking about a joke. I mean,
Well, not necessarily preaching, but the joke was that if you had long hair, you should not have a car and walk around like Jesus did. That was saying.
no, but
It was
If you go 10 or 15 years before you, it was preached a lot back in the South. Oh, yeah. And they said, doesn't nature itself teach you that man should not have long hair? How does nature teach us that man shouldn't have long hair? Well, your hair grows as long as a woman's. It will, won't it? My hair would grow as long as a woman's, maybe not as thick. But if you want to, your hair was. So what does it mean when Paul said, doesn't nature itself teach you that man should not have long hair? And then it becomes something, you lose something in the translation. And where the head covering, we say, well, it doesn't apply today. It only applied then. But the hair used to be saying, that does apply here. The long hair on man, they say that applies now. Although they're only, 5 or 10 verses apart in 1 Corinthians 11. So what's the key to it? I think the key is when they translated nature, it probably was something that meant something more like, doesn't society teach you at that time that you shouldn't have long hair? Maybe during the 50s, it wouldn't have been a good thing to have long hair. Yes?
So, I'll just throw this concept out. So I am of the persuasion that the Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, is as legitimate today as it ever was, and nothing's changed in regard to that. However, our perception of it certainly changes, and I think there's a strong argument for the plain, simple reality of what the text says. That being said, I don't think it is my duty to impose on each of us are held accountable to our understanding.
Well, I'm not trying to impose this on anybody. I'm just talking about how does nature teach us that?
So I think the way there's a in Paul's argument, if he actually are asking the serious question, in Paul's argument he actually has 3 arguments in there. One of the arguments is he talks about the custom in the world. The second argument he talks about the custom in the reality of nature, that there are differences between men and women. I think that's what he's talking about. That in nature you see males and females of any variety, just about have differences in them, right? And so, and then you see the spiritual argument that he talks about in regard to authority with angels and a number of different things, and then accepting your position that God has assigned you. So it's not really as silly of an argument as, we're tongue-in-cheeking it like, oh, what a dumb thought.
No, I'm not tongue-in-cheeking. I'm just saying there's sometimes there's words that have been translated that don't mean exactly what Paul meant, I don't think. I think he was talking about the custom. When we said nature, we assume it means, I always assumed when they said, doesn't nature itself teach you? And it was preached. Nature says a man's hair will not grow as long as a woman's.
That's not what the Bible teaches. That might be what a preacher might say, but that ain't what the Bible teaches.
It says nature itself.
Right. That nature teaches there's differences between.
No, it says that nature teaches that a man is a shame for a man to have long hair. Well, I'm just saying that I think that was probably what Paul was referring to was a custom in that day. And like I started to say, in the 50s, when that was taught, early 50s, that it probably was a shame in that time. Nobody had, the longest hair I ever seen in the 60s was the Beatles, and that wasn't very long. And before that, according to the custom,
say I don't think that any of that stuff is. That's certainly not the place to start with any Christian or any.
Oh no, I'm not talking. I'm just talking about the fact that when we read the Bible, there are words that may have changed, that mean different things. That you've got to, when you read, like when Becca reads that, she says she reads it as if it was for that day. When in the 50s, when we read that, it's the nature itself teach that the man should not have long hair. We used to read it where I really thought that a man's hair wouldn't grow as long as a woman's, because the preacher said it, and that's pretty well true. Everything he said. When you're in the pulpit, you're 6 foot above. You're 6 foot above contradictions of what they say.
I don't know. I've only experienced being 6 feet below it. So.
Oh, the pulpit. But the point, yes. go back. That was really, I got off on a tangent. I didn't want to get off. I thought people would laugh at that a little bit and say, "Oh, I see what you're talking about." But, okay, but when we read these letters and we don't know the problem they're addressing, it's hard to understand what Paul is saying. When you listen to, I'll sit and Mary talks to her sisters a lot on the phone, and when I come in, I'll say, "Oh, who are you talking to?" And she'll probably ignore me for a while, because she's getting hard of hearing. She's listening to one thing. I say, "Who are you talking to?" She's like, "Paul." Very aggravated. But when you just listen to somebody on the phone, and I know husbands don't ever do that, but when your wife is on the phone, do you ever listen to her, Mark? Well, Mary was not on the phone until we got out here, and she had 3 sisters that are pretty close. She's on the phone a lot longer now than she ever was before. But when you listen, have you ever listened to your teenager on the phone? How hard is it to understand what they're saying? Yeah. I was going to get there, Cody. Hurry up. This is interesting stuff. So you get to the book of Romans and you say, what's it all about? What's it all about? We look at words have meaning, like we talked about. Words have meaning. When you go to Romans, the 4th chapter, Romans, the 4th chapter said, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. All those who believe like Abraham had righteousness reckoned to them. We say that. We say, well, what's he talking about there? So now, we had that. Larry, why don't you go to Romans 6 and verse 16 and read it. They have righteousness reckoned to them by faith. It's all right. 6:16. Mm-hmm. So, we just said in Romans 4 that Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And all who believe the way Abraham did have righteousness reckoned to them. It's yours. What's he mean in Romans 6:16? Obedience leads to righteousness. So what's the difference? He said you already have righteousness. Now it says you got to obey to get righteousness. Yeah, but let's go to the word itself. Go to the word itself. If you look at that word, that righteousness, and that's a study I would love to get into here sometime in depth. But we look at that word righteousness, dikosanine, you got dikosanine, which is righteousness. You got dikosanine theal, which is the righteousness of God. And you've got the righteousness it talks about in Romans 6:16, same word, right? They translated it righteousness. But you can see that probably the righteousness they're talking about in Romans 16 is a real righteousness like we think of being holy. When you obey, your life becomes more holy. You become more Christ-like. When you have righteousness reckoned to you, it's not really a righteousness of saying God's righteousness is now mine or Christ's righteousness is now mine. It's saying that you're part of the covenant that Abraham made, that God made with Abraham, where it says when if you go back and look at it, and it says, and circumcision is the sign of the righteousness that Abraham had. They said circumcision was the sign or the seal of the righteousness that Abraham had. You go back to some places in the Old Testament, the circumcision is the seal or the sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham. So when you're talking about God's righteousness being put on us because of our faith, And I'm including, when I say faith, I'm including an obedient faith that talks about baptism. Just, you can't say everything every time when you teach the Bible. Certain things you sort of assume in this audience, I assume that when I talk about faith, you're talking about an obedient faith. But when you see that what God is talking about when he reckoned righteousness to Moses or Abraham, when he reckoned righteousness to Abraham, he's talking about he made a covenant with Abraham. And you could go back and you could go and look at the story of Phineas. The story of Phineas in Psalms 106. It tells a sort of abbreviated story of Phineas. And Phineas was a Jewish person when the Israelites were intermarrying with the Midianites. A person came in the camp while Moses and God were talking to him about this, came in with a Midianite woman. And Phineas got up and took a spear and went into the tent and pierced through him. And it says in Psalms 106, I guess I ought to read it because I can't quote it from Scripture. Psalms 106. Go ahead and read it.
Phineas stood up and intervened. The place was checked. This was credited to his righteousness, or unless Christ.
And that has been reckoned to him as righteousness from generation to generation. So it was reckoned that he was righteous because of his act. Now go back to Numbers, the 25th chapter. Verse 10 we'll start. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by manifesting such zeal among them on my behalf, that in my jealousy I did not consume the Israelites because of what Phinehas did. Therefore say, I hereby grant him my covenant of peace. He made a covenant with Phinehas. In Psalms, he said, righteousness has been given to him forever. In Numbers 25, it says a covenant, what was that was actually given to him. When you talk about God's faithfulness, you're normally talking about God being God's righteousness. You're talking about God being faithful to the covenants that he makes when you look at it. I know that's probably strange, but the reason I'm saying that is that when you think of it that way, then you look at Romans 4 and you look at Romans 6, and there's no tension between the two anymore. Before you had a tension. You say righteousness was reckoned to him. The other one, if you say covenant, a covenant was reckoned to him. We're in a covenant with God. Today, when we believe, we're in a covenant with God. Obedience leads to righteousness. And when you look at it, it's look at what Paul is trying to do in this book. I'd never really, and once I started researching, I see it's very, very common out there. But you know that in about AD 49, somewhere along in there, the Emperor Claudius got tired of the Jews in Rome. He expelled them out of the city. Didn't say expel the Christians, he expelled the Jews. I don't know, Jews were always rabble-rousers and not doing exactly what they're supposed to and everything. And he caused them all to leave Rome. You'll see that probably in Acts 17:18, sort of goes the same thing. In Acts 18, verse 2, I've read that all the time, and it just sort of, one of those things that just went by my head and I never even thought about it too much. Darlene, you'll read that, 18, verse 2? Acts 18, verse 2.
There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to withdraw and Paul wanted to see them.
Yeah, and they were tent makers and they lived together. But we read a lot about Ananias and Priscilla and Aquila. But it says right there that Claudius threw the Jews out of Rome. This was when he was probably in the early 50s or late 40s, somewhere along there. He drove them out, all right? So, if he drove them out, they say when you read about it, maybe gone for 10 years, something like that, okay? Now, when Paul writes a letter to the Romans, in the 16th chapter, he's got all these verses says, greet so-and-so, greet so-and-so, greet so-and-so. And two people he greets specifically was Priscilla and Aquila. They were now back in Rome. And history says that when Claudius died, when Nero came in, he let the Jews come back to Rome. So now, we've got all these churches in Rome. All these churches were in Rome. All the Jews, included the Jewish Christians, Priscilla and Aquila, were kicked out of Rome. So what did you have in the churches that were in Rome? You had the churches being run by the Gentile Christians, the ones that had been converted. So when these Christians came back in, they sort of had just like a congregation here, that you have people come in and there's sort of a jockeying for position. In other words, the Gentiles had their way of running the church, and they didn't have to worry about Passover, they didn't have to worry about the temple, they didn't have to worry or the synagogues and things like this. And back then, the Jewish Christians, the synagogue was still a big deal for them, all right? Paul had pretty well told them about circumcisions, not necessarily, but a lot of the feast days and things like that, they still, even Paul has talked about that he was keeping a fast. He had made a vow. He didn't let his hair grow for a long time. They still kept these things, even though, and it was there. And when the Jews were out of Rome, the Gentiles sort of ignored all that stuff. So they came back, and now you got this tension. You got this tension between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians as to how they're going to live together. Then that sort of gives a background of what Paul is talking about. He does so much. If you read through this Romans, you look and you read through the first four chapters, next four, the 9 through 11 and 12 through 16, 1 through 4 and 5 through 7, they all deal basically with, well, three things, I guess. I think when I study the book of Romans, there are three verses that I think sort of cover a lot of it. One is Romans 1, verse 5. He received his apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith. In Romans 16, in the last verse, next to the last verse, again, he repeats that phrase to bring about the obedience of faith. So Paul wanted all the Christians to be obedient, all right? Wanted to be obedient. The next one is Romans 1, 16 and 17. So, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to all believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And what else did it say? I forget. 1, 16, 17. Chapter 1, verse 16, 17. For in it, the righteousness is revealed from faith to faith. Said, for the gospel is the power of God for salvation, to the Jew first and also into the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. So what's he saying? The righteousness of God. If you go back and do what we talked about right there, what you're talking about when you say the righteousness of God, you're talking about God being faithful to his covenant. The righteousness of God. Going back to the covenant he made with Abraham back in Genesis, the 12th chapter, 15th chapter. Said, through your seed shall all the world be blessed. That covenant that he made with Abraham, God is now becoming faithful. He is fulfilling that covenant that he said. In the gospel is what? It's the good news about Jesus. And the good news about Jesus is the gospel. And that is the power of salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek when you look at it. So, let me see where I'm at. I didn't bring any PowerPoints today because that screen doesn't work. And I figured if I don't have anything to help me, y'all shouldn't have anything either. Last week I had to turn around and look at it because I didn't have any notes with me either. I was just going to use the PowerPoint. Okay. So last week, my focus, I called it, instead of, I called it listening to the Spirit in the text. In other words, what was the Spirit trying to say when he inspired his apostles to write these words? What was he trying to say? And today I'm going to go a step farther. And if I had a slide up there, I would have said, things are not also always what they seem to be. If you just pick up the Bible, you don't know anything about anything, and you start reading Romans, and you read Romans 4, what are you going to say? That righteousness is given to you simply on your belief. Yet you look at what I consider correct interpretation of the words. You may not agree. But I think we're talking about the righteousness that was there is the fact that God made a covenant with me. God made a covenant to the Israelis, to the Israelites. Did that mean they were saved? Were all of Israel saved? No, it goes, that's exactly what I'm saying when I get there. But if you look at that, where am I at? I'm making noise somehow. No, that's right down there. I don't know. You guys are old enough. You know what that's called right there? Yeah, it's a watch pocket. A lot of people don't know that, but I've decided it's now a phone pocket if you got a flip top. It works good. Right size, right spot. Okay. So, where was I at? Things are not always what they seem to be. You need to think about, what was Paul's purpose in the book? What was Paul's purpose? He wouldn't, there were some doctrinal issues, that's for sure. But most of it is going back to the point that Jews and Gentiles are now part of the same family. They're part of the same family. You go over to Romans 14, start talking about some of the things that are just matters of opinion in it. And of course, we can, where I came from in my history, if it's a matter of opinion, it had to do with food or drink, and that was about all it was a matter of opinion. Holy days. Anything else wasn't a matter of opinion. But, so you need to look at what Paul was trying to say. What was he trying to say? In chapter so Romans 11, verse 5. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know? And also that word foreknew right there. When any time, you look in the Old Testament when God foreknew his people, I don't think it was individually picking about a certain people. He was just saying that the family of Abraham was going to be my people. When he picked Abraham, he had Isaac and Esau. He didn't pick Esau. He picked Isaac. When Isaac had Jacob and mine went blank. Jacob and Esau. Isaac and Ishmael. I knew something was wrong there. Yeah. That's what you're here for, Mark. So, but God made a choice. And he really was selecting where his family was going to come from. So, when it says right there, has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. He was talking about the Israelites whom he selected. to be, his corporate election. I like that word, corporate election. I think that's what he's talking about in Ephesians, where it says corporate election. The church are elected to be holy. The church is elected to be holy. Do you not know that the scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have demolished your altars. I alone am left, Elijah talking, and they are seeking my life. But what is the divine reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. There's a term, chosen by grace. You can do a whole study right there, all right? How are you chosen by grace? For the grace of God has appeared doing what? Grace of God has appeared bringing salvation to all men, right? And you look at it, and what they're talking about is the grace of God sent Jesus. So when you believe, you accept that grace, all right? That's what it's talking about. So the grace of God. I have kept for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Chosen by grace. Chosen by grace in that God sent Jesus. Right? He sent the gospel. He sent the gospel. He said, if it's by grace, it's no longer on the basis of work. And when you look at Romans, and you look at the book of Galatians, and I think, if you're going to study the two books, you should study Galatians first. It was written first. Look at the book of Galatians and study it, and then go and read the book of Romans, and it helps you understand it a lot better. Because you look at Galatians, and you look right here when they said the works, not by works. We had some studies here a while back we used at Micah 6:6. What does God desire of you? But to do good and walk humbly with your God. All right? So he's always wanted us to do works to do better, to be better. All right? So what does it mean when he's talking right here, not by works? He said, yes.
Not the works of the law. Nobody can fulfill the whole complete law.
I think it's a lot simpler than that. I think what he's talking about here is the fact that you're not chosen because you have been circumcised, because you are the physical seed of Abraham. I don't think he's going into all that stuff right there. He's just saying, you're not chosen because you're circumcised. Paul was circumcised, wasn't he? Paul was circumcised. He was a Jew. Yes.
I think Abraham was reckoned.
Before circumcision. Before circumcision. Before he was circumcised. Before he was circumcised, yeah. 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 Promise has been there, but but at this time, the Israelites, who had been God's people all along, you read the book of Galatians, you'll see this. They sort of thought that the gospel went to them first, right? They thought, they even taught a lot, that you still had to be circumcised. And that was what they're talking about, the works of the law, right here. Not talking about the food laws. He said you don't need to keep the food laws. You don't need to be circumcised to be part of the church. So then we have these Jews coming back to Rome with these Gentile churches. They got this attitude, well, maybe we ought to eat fish only on Friday. I don't know. Had these dietary laws. And it created this tension, right? Paul said, no, it's because it's not by works, it's by the grace of